In Denver International Airport, a 90-year-old WWII veteran faced his most humiliating battle on American soil. What started as routine security screening took a shocking turn when federal agents arrived to bury his secrets. Colonel Franklin Morrison wasn't your typical traveler. For decades, he'd carried classified burdens from 1944, known for his unshakable honor. When TSA screening triggered federal alerts, he had no idea he was walking into a confrontation that would expose government cover-ups. His refusal to surrender his portfolio would lead to a national reckoning. What began as honoring fallen comrades would become America's darkest revelation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Franklin Morrison stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting the silver eagles on his dress blue uniform collar for the third time. At 90, his fingers weren't as steady as they once were, but muscle memory from 8 decades of military precision guided his movements. The uniform still fit, though it hung looser now on his diminished frame. The ribbon rack above his left breast pocket told a story of service most people his age could no longer tell. Purple Heart, Distinguished, Flying Cross, Air Medal with oak leaf clusters, and others whose significance had faded from public memory. He reached for the leather portfolio on his dresser, its surface worn smooth by decades of careful handling. Inside, yellowed photographs and documents waited in their precise order, just as they had for nearly 80 years. His weathered fingers traced the portfolio's edge, and for a moment, the weight of what it contained seemed heavier than his aged shoulders could bear. "Bobby would have been 92 this year," he murmured to the empty room, touching a faded photograph tucked into the portfolio's front pocket. The young bombardier smiled back at him from 1944, frozen in time, while Frank had been forced to carry on alone. The taxi ride to Denver International Airport passed in contemplative silence. Frank watched the Colorado landscape roll by, remembering when this had all been farmland before the sprawl of suburbia claimed it. Everything changed, everything except the weight of certain memories that clung to him like shadows. At the airport, Frank moved through the bustling terminal with the measured gait of a man who had learned to conserve his energy. His military bearing remained unmistakable, spine straight, eyes forward, purpose in every step. Travelers hurried past him, absorbed in their phones and immediate concerns, but occasionally someone would notice his uniform and medals, offering a respectful nod or quiet "Thank you for your service." The words always stirred something complicated in Frank's chest. Service. If only they knew the full weight of what that word meant. Agent Sarah Mitchell clipped her TSA badge to her uniform with practiced efficiency, beginning what she already knew would be another grinding shift of security theater. At 28, she'd seen enough of the agency's operations to understand that most of what they did created an illusion of safety rather than actual security. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd joined TSA, thinking it would be a way to continue serving her country after her military police career ended, but instead she found herself confiscating water bottles and wanding elderly passengers who posed no conceivable threat. "Mitchell, you're on primary screening today," Supervisor Derek Martinez called out during the morning briefing. "Remember, we've had increased oversight this week. Everything by the book." Sarah nodded, suppressing the urge to point out that she always went by the book. It was following the book that had started to eat at her conscience. The morning rush brought its usual parade of frustrated business travelers, families juggling luggage and children, and the occasional passenger who seemed genuinely confused by security procedures that changed without notice. Sarah processed them all with professional courtesy, but her mind wandered to the letter from the Veterans Administration she'd received last week. Something about her great-grandfather's military records being declassified after all these years. Robert Mitchell, killed in action over Germany in 1944. She'd planned to look into it when she had time. Time. That was something Frank Morrison was acutely aware of as he approached the security checkpoint. At 90, every day felt borrowed, every moment precious. But it wasn't death he feared. It was dying with his secrets intact, taking them to a grave that would become just another marker in a forgotten corner of a military cemetery. Sarah noticed him immediately. The dress uniform was unmistakable, as was the way he carried himself. Her military police training had taught her to read people, and everything about this man spoke of genuine service, genuine sacrifice. His medals weren't worn for show. They were worn with quiet pride earned through actions most people couldn't imagine. "Good morning, sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying the respect due to a veteran of his obvious stature. "Flying somewhere special today?" Frank's weathered face creased into a small smile. "Final reunion for the 398th Bombardment Group. Most of us who are left won't make it to the next one." "The 398th," Sarah repeated, something stirring in her memory. "European theater?" "That's right, B-17s over Germany." Frank's grip tightened imperceptibly on his portfolio. "You know your military history." "My family has a long tradition of service," Sarah replied, then gestured toward the X-ray machine. "I'll need you to place your bag and any personal items." "In the bin, sir." Frank hesitated for just a moment, his hand protective over the portfolio. "This contains some personal military documents. Some of them are quite old and fragile." "I understand, sir. We'll be very careful." Sarah's tone remained respectful, but she could see the conflict in the old veteran's eyes. There was something about that portfolio, the way he held it, the reluctance in his movements, that spoke of deeper significance than simple nostalgia. Frank placed the portfolio in the bin, with the careful reverence one might show a flag-draped casket. As it disappeared into the X-ray machine, something passed across his features that Sarah recognized from her own military experience. The look of a soldier forced to trust others with something precious. The X-ray operator, a newer employee, named Rodriguez, frowned at his screen. "Agent Mitchell, you need to see this." Sarah moved to look at the monitor. The portfolio's contents showed clearly. Documents, photographs, and what appeared to be additional items that weren't immediately identifiable on the screen. Standard procedure would require a physical inspection, but something about the elderly, veteran's bearing made her hesitate. "Sir, I'm going to need to examine the contents of your portfolio," she said, keeping her voice gentle. Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As I mentioned, some of those documents are quite fragile, and some of them—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some of them contain information that was classified when I served." "I understand your concern, sir, but—" "No," Frank said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "I don't. Think you do understand. Some secrets are kept for good reasons, Agent Mitchell." Sarah felt the familiar tension that came when security protocols clashed with human dignity. Here was a man who had clearly served his country with distinction, a veteran in his final years seeking nothing more than to honor fallen comrades at what might be his last reunion. But the procedures were clear, and increasingly, those procedures left no room for common sense or respect. Behind Frank, other passengers were beginning to back up in the line. Rodriguez looked to Sarah for direction, while the X-ray machine's image remained frozen on the screen, showing the mysterious contents of a portfolio that its owner guarded like a sacred trust. Frank Morrison met Sarah Mitchell's eyes across the security checkpoint, and in that moment, both of them sensed that what happened next would ripple far beyond this simple interaction. Neither could have predicted that within hours, federal agents would descend on Denver International Airport, or that the contents of that weathered leather portfolio would threaten to expose secrets that powerful people had spent decades ensuring remained buried. The routine security screening was about to become anything but routine. The routine security screening was about to become anything but routine. Sarah looked from the X-ray monitor to Frank's weathered face, seeing something in his eyes that made her pause. Years of military police work had taught her to recognize when someone was hiding something, but also when that something might be worth hiding. The old colonel's protective stance over his portfolio spoke of burdens carried, not threats posed. "Sir, I need to respect the protocols, but I also want to respect your service," Sarah said carefully. "Perhaps if you could just show me the general contents without removing everything." Frank's grip on the portfolio tightened. "Agent Mitchell, some of what's in here has been classified for 80 years. I'm not even certain what the current status is." Rodriguez shifted impatiently behind the X-ray machine. "Mitchell, we've got a line backing up. Just do the inspection." Before Sarah could respond, Supervisor Derek Martinez appeared at her shoulder, drawn by the delay. His eyes took in Frank's uniform and medals with practiced assessment, the kind of calculation that weighed public relations against procedural compliance. "Problem here?" Derek's voice carried the bureaucratic authority of middle management under pressure. "No problem," Sarah said quickly. "Just being thorough with a veteran's personal items." Derek glanced at the X-ray monitor, then at Frank. "Sir, I appreciate your service, but we need to complete our security screening. Standard procedure requires physical inspection of any items that can't be clearly identified." Frank drew himself up to his full height, and despite his age, there was something commanding in his bearing that made both TSA agents step back slightly. "Son, I've been keeping certain secrets since before you were born. Some things are bigger than your procedures." "Sir, with all due respect, nothing is bigger than national security," Derek replied, his tone growing firmer. "I'm going to need you to cooperate with our inspection, or I'll have to call additional personnel." Sarah watched the interaction with growing unease. Something about this felt wrong, not dangerous, but wrong in a deeper way. Here was a man who had clearly served his country with distinction, being treated like a potential threat for protecting what appeared to be personal military documents. "Derek," she said quietly, "maybe we could make an exception." "No exceptions," Derek cut her off. "Not with increased oversight this week. Everything by the book." He turned back to Frank. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." Frank's face went carefully blank, the expression of a soldier receiving unwelcome orders. "What kind of additional screening?" "Physical pat-down and complete search of your belongings. Standard procedure when a passenger refuses to cooperate with initial screening." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Frank looked at Derek, then at Sarah, and something shifted in his expression. A resignation that spoke of battles lost not to enemy fire, but to the grinding machinery of institutional indifference. "Very well," Frank said quietly. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest as she watched Derek signal for backup officers. Within minutes, Frank Morrison, a man who had faced German fighters over Nazi airspace, was being led to a private screening room for the kind of humiliating search typically reserved for suspected threats. The private screening room was sterile and cold, designed to strip away dignity along with clothing. Frank stood in the center of the small space, his portfolio set aside on a metal table, while two male TSA officers prepared to conduct their search. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove your uniform jacket and shirt," Officer Williams said, his voice professionally neutral. Frank's hands moved slowly to his jacket buttons, each motion deliberate and controlled. As the uniform jacket came off, revealing the crisp white shirt beneath, the weight of 8 decades seemed to settle more heavily on his shoulders. "The shirt as well, sir." Sarah watched through the observation window, her training as a military police officer warring, with her growing sense that they were crossing a line that should never be crossed. When Frank removed his shirt, revealing a torso mapped with old scars, shrapnel wounds, surgery scars, the accumulated damage of a warrior's life, she had to look away. Frank stood perfectly still during the search, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his face a mask of military bearing. But Sarah saw what the searching officers missed, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened when they examined old wounds, the quiet tears that gathered in the corners of his eyes. "Clear," Officer Williams announced after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. As Frank slowly redressed, Sarah noticed his movements had become more careful, more fragile. The search had taken something from him that couldn't be. Given back, not his dignity, which he maintained through sheer force of will, but something else. Trust, perhaps, or faith in the institutions he had served. "The portfolio, sir," Derek said when Frank emerged from the screening room. "We still need to examine its contents." Frank looked at the leather case sitting on the metal table, then at Derek, then at Sarah. For a moment she thought he might refuse entirely. Instead, he walked to the table with the measured steps of a man approaching a gallows. "Some of what you're about to see," Frank said quietly, "was classified at the highest levels when I served. I've kept it secret for 80 years, not because I was ordered to, but because the truth of it would dishonor the memory of better men than myself." His hands shook slightly as he opened the portfolio's worn clasp. Inside, Sarah glimpsed yellowed documents, faded photographs, and what appeared to be official military correspondence bearing classifications and stamps she didn't recognize. Frank pulled out a single photograph, young airmen standing before a B-17 bomber, their faces bright with the confidence of youth that had never contemplated mortality. "My crew," he said simply. "Operation Nightfall, October 1944. I'm the only one who came home." Derek reached for the photograph, but Frank's hand closed over it protectively. "That's enough." "Sir, I need to examine all contents." I said, "That's enough." Frank's voice carried the authority of command, the tone of a man who had given orders in combat and expected them to be obeyed. The standoff stretched between them, the elderly veteran and the middle management supervisor, while Sarah felt the weight of institutional protocol crushing something precious and irreplaceable. What none of them knew was that Frank's military record had triggered automatic alerts the moment his name entered the TSA database. 300 miles away, computers were flagging classified associations and phones were beginning to ring. In offices where decisions were made about what truths were safe to tell. The examination of the portfolio was about to become the least of their problems. The examination of the portfolio was about to become the least of their problems. Frank sat alone in the sterile holding area, his uniform jacket draped carefully. Over the back of his plastic chair, his portfolio secured in TSA custody, pending further review. Daidun, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, with the same monotonous drone that had filled too many waiting rooms, debriefing chambers, and medical facilities throughout his long life. But as he closed his eyes, the sound transformed into something else entirely. The steady throb of 4 Wright Cyclone engines carrying him and his crew into the October sky over England, 1944. The memory hit him like flak, sudden and devastating. "Nightfall Squadron, this is Control. Weather's clearing over the target. Your go for mission." Lieutenant Frank Morrison adjusted his headset and glanced back at his crew. Navigator Tom Chen was hunched over his charts, calculating wind drift, with the precision that had kept them alive through 17 previous missions. Behind him, Bombardier Bobby Mitchell was checking his equipment one final time, his young face serious with concentration. "Bobby, you ready back there?" Frank called through the intercom. "Born ready, Skipper. Let's go ruin Hitler's day." The easy confidence in Bobby's voice made Frank smile. At 25, Bobby Mitchell was the youngest member of their crew, but he'd proven himself over the skies of Europe with a steady hand and unshakable courage. The kid had a girl back home in Colorado, same hometown where Sarah Mitchell would be born decades later, though none of them knew the threads of fate that connected their stories. Frank's eyes snapped open as a TSA officer walked past his holding area, the sound of footsteps pulling him back to the present. But the memories had been unleashed now, and they came in waves that 80 years of discipline couldn't hold back. The briefing had been different for Operation Nightfall. Instead of the usual industrial targets, factories, rail yards, airfields, they were shown photographs of what appeared to be a research facility in the Bavarian mountains. Intelligence indicates this facility is developing experimental weapons. The briefing officer had said, "Your mission is to destroy it completely. Nothing can be left standing." Frank had studied the reconnaissance photos, noting the unusual architecture, the heavy security, the underground components that suggested this was more than a simple research station. "What kind of experimental weapons?" he'd asked. "That's classified above your clearance level, Lieutenant. Your job is to put your bombs on target and get your crew home." But as they'd approached the target that October morning, Frank had realized the briefing hadn't told them everything. The facility was larger than the photographs suggested, with extensive underground components and defensive positions that spoke of something far more significant than a simple research station. "Jesus Christ," Bobby's voice had crackled through the intercom as they began their bombing run. "Skipper, you seeing what I'm seeing down there?" Through the bomb bay, Frank had glimpsed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Railway cars, but not for transporting materials. These cars were for transporting people. The research facility was something else entirely, something that made their mission both more urgent and more terrible. "Stay focused, Bobby. We have a job to do." "Roger that, but Skipper, those aren't just scientists down there." Frank rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the memories, but they kept coming. The facility had been developing something called Project Mercury, experimental weapons that use principles the Allies desperately needed to understand or destroy. But the mission had been compromised from the start. German fighters had been waiting for them, more than intelligence had suggested, as if someone had known they were coming. The first burst of flak had taken out their No. 3 engine, sending the B-17 into a sickening spiral that Frank fought to control. Around them, the rest of Nightfall Squadron was breaking formation under heavy fighter attack. "Bandits at 2 o'clock. Tom Chen's voice was tight with fear. "Multiple contacts." The Messerschmitt came out of the sun like an avenging angel, its guns stitching a line of holes across their starboard wing. Frank threw the bomber into a diving turn, but the German pilot was skilled, staying with them through the maneuver. "Bobby, we need those bombs gone now." "Working on it, Skipper." "Bomb bay doors are damaged." Through his earphones, Frank could hear Bobby struggling with the manual release. His breathing labored as he worked the controls by hand. The young bombardier was lying exposed in the nose of the aircraft, German fighters swarming around them, like angry wasps. Another burst of cannon fire, and Frank felt the controls go sluggish. Hydraulics hit. They were losing altitude fast. The other bombers of Nightfall Squadron scattered or shot down around them. "Bobby, report!" No answer. "Bobby!" Frank had left his pilot's seat, climbing back to check on his bombardier, and found Bobby Mitchell, slumped over his equipment, blood spreading across his flight jacket. But the young man's eyes were still alert, still focused on his mission. "Bombs! Away!" Bobby whispered, his hand on the manual release. "Package delivered, Skipper." Those were his last words. A tear rolled down Frank's weathered cheek. As he sat in the airport holding area, remembering the weight of Bobby's body as he'd tried to drag him to safety, the way the young bombardier's blood had stained his hands. They'd made it back to England somehow, Frank and two other survivors from a crew of 10, but Bobby Mitchell had died protecting whatever secrets lay in that Bavarian facility. The mission reports had been classified immediately. The debriefing had taken place in a windowless room with officers Frank had never seen before, men who spoke in careful phrases about national security and the need for absolute silence. The facility they'd bombed, they were told, had been developing weapons that could have changed the course of the war. The technology had been recovered by Allied forces, but the mission itself was to remain classified indefinitely. "The men who died today died heroes," one of the officers had said. "But their heroism must remain secret to protect ongoing operations." Frank had been 22 years old, overwhelmed by grief and trauma, and he'd accepted their explanation. He'd kept the secret through the rest of the war, through his return home, through marriage and children and a career in the peacetime Air Force. He'd kept it even when he began to suspect that the ongoing operations they'd spoken of had lasted far longer than any war. Now, at 90, sitting in a sterile airport holding room after being strip-searched like a common criminal, Frank finally understood the true weight of the burden he'd carried. Bobby Mitchell and the others hadn't just died for their country, they'd died for secrets that powerful people were still willing to kill to protect. The sound of approaching footsteps made Frank open his eyes. Through the glass partition, he could see men in dark suits, flashing credentials to Derek Martinez. Their faces carrying the bureaucratic authority that Frank recognized from decades of military service. His past had finally caught up with him. General Patricia Hawthorne stepped through the terminal doors with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed from her path. At 55, she carried herself with the rigid bearing of a career officer who had climbed the Pentagon's ranks through political acumen rather than battlefield experience. Behind her, Agent David Park matched her pace, his younger features set in the professionally neutral expression that marked him as intelligence community. "The situation is contained?" Hawthorne asked without preamble as Derek Martinez approached. Them, his TSA supervisor credentials suddenly seeming inadequate in the presence of federal authority. "Yes, ma'am. The subject is in holding area 3. We've secured his personal effects pending review." Derek's voice carried the careful deference of middle management, recognizing their place in a much larger hierarchy. Hawthorne's eyes swept the security checkpoint with tactical assessment. "Who conducted the initial screening?" "Agent Mitchell, ma'am. She's one of our most experienced officers." "I'll need to speak with her immediately, and I want a complete suppression of any incident reports. Nothing goes into the system until I've reviewed it personally." Agent Park produced a tablet, his fingers moving efficiently across its surface. "Colonel Morrison's file is extensive, multiple classification levels, some dating back to 1944. "I'm aware of the Colonel's history," Hawthorne said, her tone suggesting intimate familiarity with details that others weren't cleared to. "I know. The question is how much he's retained and whether he understands the current implications of his memories." Sarah Mitchell was reviewing passenger manifests when the federal agents found her, though her mind kept drifting to the elderly colonel in holding. Something about his treatment had left her deeply unsettled. Not just the strip search, but the way he'd protected that portfolio, as if it contained more than mere nostalgia. "Agent Mitchell." Hawthorne's voice carried unmistakable authority. "I'm General Hawthorne, DOD. I need to discuss the incident with Colonel Morrison." Sarah straightened instinctively, her military police training recognizing the voice of command. "Yes, ma'am. Though I should note that Colonel Morrison was cooperative throughout the screening process. Tell me exactly what he said about the contents of his portfolio." "He mentioned that some documents were classified when he served, and that he'd kept certain secrets for 80 years. He seemed protective of his crew's memory. Hawthorne and Park exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge and growing concern. Did he mention Operation Nightfall specifically? Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. He mentioned his crew from October 1944, said he was the only one who came home. What else? He had a photograph of his aircrew. One of them was named Bobby Mitchell. Sarah paused, memory stirring. That's interesting. My great-grandfather was Robert Mitchell, killed in action over Germany in 1944. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Agent Park's stylus stopped moving across his tablet, and General Hawthorne's expression shifted from bureaucratic efficiency to something more personal, more dangerous. Agent Mitchell, Hawthorne said carefully, I'm going to need you to understand that what we're dealing with here involves matters of national security that transcend normal TSA protocols. Your great-grandfather's service record intersects with classified operations that remain sensitive today. Across the terminal, investigative journalist Marcus Webb was having coffee and working on his laptop when the federal agents arrived. 20 years of covering military affairs had given him an instinct for when something ordinary was becoming something significant. The sight of DoD credentials and the careful way TSA personnel were being managed told him this wasn't routine oversight. Marcus had been blacklisted from major news organizations after getting too close to classified operations in Afghanistan. But his freelance work had taught him to recognize the patterns of institutional cover-up. He began taking discreet photographs with his phone, noting badge numbers and documenting the unusual federal presence. Sir, I'm going to need you to delete those photos. Agent Park appeared at Marcus's table with practiced authority. On what grounds? Marcus kept his voice level, his journalist's instincts fully engaged. This is a public area of a civilian airport. National security grounds. There's an ongoing investigation. Marcus studied the younger agent's face, recognizing the uncomfortable expression of someone following orders they didn't entirely understand. Investigation into what? Airport security procedures. I'm not authorized to discuss details. Then you're not authorized to demand I delete legal documentation of federal overreach. Marcus closed his laptop deliberately. Unless you're prepared to arrest me, Agent Park, and I'm asking for your cooperation in a matter involving potential threats to national security. The only threat I see is to a 90-year-old veteran's dignity. Meanwhile, General Hawthorne was reviewing Frank Morrison's complete military file on a secured tablet, her expression growing increasingly grim as she scrolled through decades of classified annotations. Operation Nightfall had been buried, so deeply that most records had been purged. But Frank Morrison's name appeared in connection with post-war intelligence assessments that carried the highest classification levels. The technology recovered from that facility, she murmured to Agent Park. It influenced weapons development for decades. If Morrison retained specific knowledge, the implications could be significant, Park agreed, especially given current geopolitical tensions. Hawthorne's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. After reading it, her jaw tightened. We have authorization to contain the situation, full spectrum. Preparing and narrating this story it's a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ma'am, Colonel Morrison doesn't leave this airport until we understand exactly what he knows and who he might have shared it with. She paused, glancing toward the holding area where Frank waited. And his family connections need to be managed. His family. Captain James Morrison, currently stationed at Peterson Air Force Base, the Colonel's great-nephew. He's being contacted now to assist with family intervention. As if summoned by their conversation, Derek Martinez approached with a phone. "General, there's a Captain Morrison on the line. Says he received urgent notification about his great-uncle." Hawthorne took the phone with satisfaction. Family pressure was often more effective than official threats, especially with men of Frank Morrison's generation who valued loyalty above all else. "Captain Morrison, this is General Hawthorne. We have a situation involving your great-uncle that requires immediate family support." In the holding area, Frank Morrison sat, perfectly still, watching federal agents move through the terminal like pieces on a chessboard. He'd seen this kind of operation before. The careful coordination, the way civilian authorities deferred to military command, the systematic isolation of a target. They thought they were containing him, but Frank understood something they didn't. After 80 years of silence, the weight of secrets had become unbearable. Bobby Mitchell and his crewmates deserved better than to have their sacrifice buried beneath layers of institutional convenience. The question was no longer whether Frank would reveal the truth about Operation Nightfall. The question was whether anyone would survive the revelation. The question was no longer whether Frank would reveal the truth about Operation Nightfall. The question was whether anyone would survive the revelation. Captain James Morrison's F-16 had just touched down at Peterson Air Force Base when his phone buzzed with an urgent notification. The message was brief but alarming. "Family emergency. Report immediately to Colonel Harrison's office." Jimmy's mind raced through possibilities as he completed his post-flight checks. His great-uncle Frank was the only family he had left, and at 90, any emergency could be serious. 20 minutes later, Jimmy stood at attention in Colonel Harrison's office, still wearing his flight suit, as his commanding officer delivered news that made no sense. "Captain, your great-uncle has been detained at Denver International Airport in connection with a national security matter. General Hawthorne from the Pentagon is requesting your immediate assistance as family liaison. Sir, there must be some mistake. Uncle Frank is flying to his regimental reunion. He's a decorated World War II veteran, not a security threat." Colonel Harrison's expression was carefully neutral. "Captain, I'm not privy to the details. Your orders are to proceed to DIA immediately and provide whatever assistance General Hawthorne requires." The 40-minute drive to Denver International gave Jimmy time to process the impossibility of what he'd been told. Frank Morrison was the most honorable man Jimmy knew, a living link to the greatest generation, a man who had shaped Jimmy's own decision to serve. The idea that Uncle Frank could be involved in anything threatening national security was absurd. But as Jimmy entered the terminal and saw the discreet federal presence, the careful way passengers were being rerouted around certain areas, he began to understand that something significant was happening. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. General Hawthorne intercepted him near the security checkpoint, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Captain Morrison, thank you for coming quickly. Your great-uncle is having difficulty cooperating with the routine security review. Ma'am, with respect, my great-uncle served his country for over 30 years. If he's having difficulty, there's probably a good reason." Hawthorne studied Jimmy with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to measuring loyalty and potential resistance. "Captain, your great-uncle is in possession of materials related to classified operations from World War II. Operations that remain sensitive today." "What kind of operations?" "That's above your clearance level. What I need from you is family. Influence. Help him understand that cooperation serves everyone's interests." Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was conducting her own investigation using her TSA access to pull up military records that had recently been declassified. The name Bobby Mitchell had been nagging at her since Frank mentioned it, and now she understood why. Her great-grandfather hadn't just been killed in action. He'd been part of something called Operation Nightfall, a mission so classified that most details remained redacted even in the declassified portions. The connections were becoming impossible to ignore. Frank Morrison and Bobby Mitchell had served together, flown together, and based on the dates, probably died together, except Frank had somehow survived. The thought sent chills through Sarah as she realized she was looking at her own family history, a history that powerful people were apparently still trying to keep buried. Derek Martinez found her hunched over the computer terminal, scrolling through documents with intense concentration. "Mitchell, what are you doing? General Hawthorne wants all personnel to maintain normal operations." "Derek, my great-grandfather served with Colonel Morrison. They were on the same crew." So why are federal agents treating a 90-year-old veteran like a terrorist for carrying photos of his dead friends? Derek glanced around nervously. "Sarah, whatever's going on here is way above our pay grade. We need to stay out of it. My great-grandfather died for this country. The least I can do is make sure his sacrifice is treated with respect." In the secure area where Frank waited, the reunion with his great-nephew brought a mixture of relief and concern. Jimmy had always been Frank's pride, a continuation of the family's military tradition, a young man who understood duty and honor. But seeing Jimmy in this context, clearly sent by the same people who had humiliated Frank with their search, created a complicated, emotional landscape. "Uncle Frank." Jimmy's voice carried genuine concern as he entered the holding area. You all right? They said there was some kind of security issue." Frank studied his great-nephew's face, noting the military bearing, the uniform that commanded respect in ways his own no longer seemed to. "Jimmy, I suppose they sent you to talk sense into the crazy old man." "They sent me because I'm family. Because I care about you." Jimmy sat down across from Frank, their conversation observed through one-way glass by federal agents. "Uncle Frank, what's this about? What's in that portfolio that has everyone so concerned?" For a moment, Frank considered telling Jimmy everything, about Operation Nightfall, about Bobby Mitchell, about the secrets that had eaten at him for 8 decades. But looking at his great-nephew's earnest face, Frank realized that some burdens shouldn't be passed to the next generation. "Jimmy, what do you know about my war service? What you've told me. Bomber missions over Germany. You were shot down once but made it back. You don't like to talk about the details." "There are good reasons for that." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Some things that happened during the war. Some operations. They remain classified not because they're dangerous, but because they're shameful." General Hawthorne's voice crackled through an earpiece that Agent Park wore. "Is he talking?" "Family conversation. Nothing substantive yet. Increase the pressure. Make it clear that cooperation serves everyone's interests, including his nephew's career." Park shifted uncomfortably. The longer this operation continued, the more it felt like intimidation rather than legitimate national security work. Frank Morrison was a decorated veteran, not a foreign agent, and the heavy-handed approach seemed disproportionate to any conceivable threat. Jimmy leaned closer to his great-uncle. "Uncle Frank, whatever happened during the war, whatever you're carrying in that portfolio, it was 80 years ago. How could it possibly threaten national security today?" Frank's laugh was bitter. "You'd be surprised how long some secrets stay dangerous, Jimmy, especially when they involve things the government would prefer people didn't know about." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make heroes look like victims and victories look like sacrifices." Frank's voice carried the weight of decades. "The kind that make young men like your friend Bobby Mitchell die not for their country, but for their country's convenience." Jimmy felt something cold in his stomach. "Bobby Mitchell, your friend Sarah's great-grandfather. He died in my arms over Germany, protecting secrets that should have died with him." The revelation hit Jimmy like a physical blow. The TSA, agent who had been treating his great-uncle with such respect. Her great-grandfather had served with Uncle Frank, had died with Uncle Frank's crew. She doesn't know, does she? She's beginning to figure it out, and that's why they're so worried. Frank looked toward the one-way glass, knowing he was being observed. Some secrets create their own momentum, Jimmy. Once people start asking the right questions, the answers become inevitable. Through the glass, General Hawthorne watched the family reunion with growing concern. Frank Morrison was more dangerous than they had anticipated, not because of what he might do, but because of what he represented. A living witness to operations that multiple administrations had worked to keep buried. The containment was about to become much more complicated. Elena Vasquez moved through the terminal with the careful determination of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite its increasing hostility toward the elderly. At 88, she carried herself with the erect posture of a woman who had spent decades in military hospitals, treating wounded soldiers with efficiency and compassion. Her flight to Denver had been delayed, giving her an unexpected layover that she was using to stretch her legs and observe the curious federal activity around the security checkpoint. Something about the scene felt familiar, the way uniformed personnel deferred to plainclothes authority, the careful management of information, the discreet cordoning of areas. She'd seen it before in field hospitals when classified casualties were brought in, men whose wounds told stories that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Then she saw him. Even at a distance, even after 80 years, Eleanor recognized the bearing of Colonel Franklin Morrison. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been lying in a hospital bed in England, recovering from wounds that the official reports claimed came from a routine bombing mission. But Eleanor had treated enough men to know the difference between flak wounds and bullet wounds, between normal combat trauma and the particular devastation that came from betrayal. Frank Morrison, she whispered to herself, then began walking toward the security area with purpose that made TSA agents step aside. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this area is restricted." Agent Williams moved to intercept her. "Young man, I'm 88. Years old, I've been traveling for 12 hours, and I just recognized someone I haven't seen since 1944. Unless you plan to arrest me, step aside." The authority in her voice, the tone of someone who had given orders in operating rooms while artillery fell outside, made Williams hesitate just long enough for Eleanor to push past him. Marcus Webb had been watching the federal operation. With growing interest, his journalist instincts fully engaged. The arrival of the elderly woman and her obvious recognition of someone in the secure area added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming more intriguing by the hour. He began following her progress, his phone discreetly recording the interaction. "Colonel Morrison!" Eleanor's voice carried across the security checkpoint with surprising strength. "Frank Morrison, don't you dare pretend you don't hear me." Through the glass of the holding area, Frank looked up at the sound of his name, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching relief. Eleanor Vasquez, Nurse Lieutenant Eleanor Vasquez, who had treated the survivors of Operation Nightfall, with questions in her eyes but discretion on her lips. General Hawthorne appeared at Agent Park's shoulder. "Who is that woman?" Park was already pulling up information on his tablet. "Eleanor Vasquez, retired. Former Army nurse, served in the European theater 1943 to 1945. She's..." He paused, scrolling through classified annotations. "She's listed in several incident reports related to Operation Nightfall. Get her contained, now." But Eleanor had already reached the holding area, her voice carrying clearly to Frank. "Frank Morrison, you look exactly like you did when they brought you to my hospital in 1944, still carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Frank stood slowly, his hand pressed against the glass. "Eleanor, after all these years." I knew you'd survived, but I never knew what happened after. The report said routine combat mission, but I treated 3 survivors of your crew. Their wounds told a different story. Agent Park approached Eleanor with professional courtesy that barely masked urgency. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from this area. There's an ongoing security investigation. Eleanor fixed him with the steady gaze of someone who had faced down military bureaucrats in 3 different wars. Young man, I've been keeping military secrets since before you were born. If Frank Morrison is involved in a security investigation, then someone has made a very serious mistake. Ma'am, I need you to cooperate. What I need, Eleanor interrupted, is for someone to explain why a decorated war hero is being treated like a criminal for carrying photographs of his dead friends. Sarah Mitchell had been watching the interaction from her position at the security station, and Eleanor's words struck her like a physical blow. Photographs of dead friends. Her great-grandfather, Bobby Mitchell, was in those photographs, part of a crew that had died in some kind of classified operation that people were still trying to cover up. She moved toward the group, her TSA credentials giving her access that others lacked. Ma'am, you mentioned survivors of Colonel Morrison's crew. Do you remember their names? Eleanor studied Sarah's face with the careful assessment of someone trained to read people quickly and accurately. I remember all their names, Morrison, Patterson, Davies, and I remember the one who didn't make it back, Bobby Mitchell, died protecting something that the brass said was too important to acknowledge. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Bobby Mitchell was my great-grandfather. The silence that followed was profound. In the space of a sentence, the abstract, historical connection had become intensely personal. Eleanor reached out and took Sarah's hand with surprising gentleness. Your great-grandfather was a hero, child. He died saving Frank's life and protecting secrets that probably should have died with him. Marcus Webb moved closer, his journalistic instincts recognizing a moment of truth. What kind of secrets? General Hawthorne's voice cut through the growing crowd like a blade. That's enough. Everyone step away from the secure area immediately. But Eleanor had spent too many years dealing with military authority to be intimidated. Now, General, and yes, I can spot your type from across a room. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here? This man served his country with distinction for over 30 years. Ma'am, there are national security implications. The only national security implication I see is the complete absence of respect for veterans. Eleanor's voice carried the moral authority of someone who had dedicated her life to healing the wounds that military service inflicted. Frank Morrison and his crew died for this country. The fact that only Frank survived doesn't make him a threat. It makes him a treasure. Agent Park found himself watching the confrontation with growing discomfort. His grandfather had fought alongside American forces in Korea, had spoken often about the bonds forged in combat and the sacred duty to honor those who served. Watching Frank Morrison being treated like a potential terrorist while an elderly nurse defended his honor felt fundamentally wrong. Jimmy Morrison emerged from the holding area, his face set with the kind of determination that ran in his family. General Hawthorne, I need to understand what's happening here. My great-uncle is being treated like an enemy combatant, and now you're detaining witnesses? Captain Morrison, I strongly suggest you remember your oath of loyalty. My oath is to the Constitution, ma'am, not to covering up whatever happened 80 years ago. Marcus Webb was recording everything now, the careful balance of federal authority beginning to crumble under the weight of human decency. For the record, can someone explain why multiple federal agents are needed to investigate an elderly veteran's photo album? Eleanor looked from Jimmy to Sarah to Marcus, recognizing kindred spirits in the growing circle of people who were asking the right questions. Because it's not just a photo album. It's evidence of something that powerful people have spent decades trying to forget. She turned to face General Hawthorne directly. Frank Morrison isn't just carrying memories, General. He's carrying proof. And after 80 years of silence, it appears he's finally ready to share it. The federal containment operation was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare, but more than that, it was becoming a moral reckoning that threatened to expose secrets that had been buried since the Second World War. Frank Morrison stood in his holding area, surrounded by an unlikely collection of allies, and realized that for the first time in 80 years, he wasn't alone with his burden. The truth was about to become impossible to contain. The truth was about to become impossible to contain. Frank Morrison looked through the glass at the growing circle of allies. His great-nephew Jimmy, the TSA agent whose great-grandfather had died in his arms, the elderly nurse who had treated his wounds and kept his secrets, and the journalist, whose presence meant the story would spread beyond this sterile airport confrontation. For 80 years, he had carried his burden alone, but now he saw faces that deserved to know what Bobby Mitchell and the others had died for. "Let me speak to them," Frank said quietly to Agent Park, who stood nearest the holding area entrance. "All of them, together." Park glanced toward General Hawthorne, who was engaged in an intense phone conversation 20 feet away. Her face had grown increasingly grim as reports filtered in from Washington about media interest and congressional inquiries that were already beginning. "Sir, I don't have authorization." "Son, I'm 90 years old, and I've kept secrets that have eaten at me every day since 1944. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm telling you that the time for secrets is over." Something in Frank's voice, the quiet authority of a man who had commanded others in combat, made Park step aside. The young agent had been watching the operation with growing unease, recognizing that they were suppressing truth rather than protecting security. Frank emerged from the holding area and walked slowly toward the group. Jimmy moved to support his great-uncle's arm, but Frank waved him off gently. This was something he needed to do under his own strength. "Eleanor," Frank said, reaching out to take the elderly nurse's hands. "You remember the hospital in England? October 1944. 3 survivors from a crew of 10. "I remember everything, Frank. The wounds that didn't match the official reports, the way you boys looked when they brought you in, not just injured, but betrayed." Sarah stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about my great-grandfather. Tell me how Bobby Mitchell really died." Frank's eyes filled with tears that had been held back for 8 decades. "Bobby died, saving my life and protecting a secret that I should have revealed the day we got back. He died believing he was serving his country, not knowing that his country had already decided he was expendable." The memory crashed over him like a wave. October 15th, 1944. The briefing room at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, where young men were given orders that would send most of them to their deaths. Operation Nightfall, the intelligence officer had said, pointing to aerial photographs of the Bavarian facility. "This installation is developing experimental weapons based on theoretical research that could change the balance of the war. Your mission is to destroy it completely." What they hadn't been told was that Allied intelligence had already identified the facility's true purpose. It wasn't just developing weapons, it was testing them on prisoners, using forced labor from concentration camps to build devices that violated every principle of civilized warfare. "The secondary objective," the officer had continued, "is recovery of specific research materials. Dr. Heinrich Richter's work on Project Mercury must be captured intact." Frank had raised his hand. "Sir, if we're bombing the facility, how do we recover research materials?" "That's been arranged, Lieutenant. Your bombing run will create a diversion while special forces infiltrate the underground sections." Frank looked at the faces surrounding him. Family, strangers, people who had become connected by threads of history and sacrifice. "We were bait," he said simply. "The entire squadron, Operation Nightfall, was designed to fail." Marcus Webb had his phone recording, recognizing that he was witnessing a moment of historical significance. "What do you mean, designed to fail?" "The Germans knew we were coming. They had to know, because the real mission, the infiltration to capture Dr. Richter's research, required the facility's defenses to be focused on us. 10 B-17s and their crews were sacrificed to provide cover for a handful of special forces. Operatives." Eleanor's face had gone pale. "The survivors I treated, they said the same thing. Too many fighters waiting, too much flak, as if the Germans had been expecting you." "Because they had been." Frank's voice carried the weight of 8 decades of suppressed fury. Dr. Heinrich Richter was already in Allied custody, had been for weeks. The bombing mission was theater, designed to make the Germans think their security had held, while we copied everything and smuggled Richter to safety. Jimmy felt something cold settling in his stomach. "Uncle Frank, are you saying the military deliberately sent air crew on a suicide mission?" "I'm saying that Bobby Mitchell and 97 other young men died to protect a secret that was more important to the brass than their lives." Frank pulled out his portfolio, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. "And I'm saying that the research they died for, it didn't stop with the war." Agent Park was listening despite himself, his recording device capturing every word. His grandfather had told him stories about the honor of military service, the bonds between soldiers, the sacred duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Nothing his grandfather had said prepared him for the possibility that the military might sacrifice its own for political convenience. Frank pulled out a document from his portfolio, its pages yellowed with age, but its text still clearly visible. "Project Mercury didn't end in 1945. The research we captured from Dr. Richter became the foundation for weapons development that continued for decades. Chemical weapons, biological agents, psychological warfare techniques, all tested on soldiers who thought they were volunteers for routine medical studies." Sarah recognized the classification stamps, the formal military language that turned human suffering into bureaucratic necessity. "My great-grandfather died for this?" "Your great-grandfather died believing he was protecting American soldiers from German weapons. He never knew that American scientists would use the same research to experiment on American soldiers." Frank's voice broke slightly. "Bobby saved my life in the cockpit of that bomber. He died making sure I got home to tell the truth, and I've failed him every day since by keeping silent." General Hawthorne ended her phone call and turned to see Frank surrounded by listeners, his portfolio open, documents visible. Her face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, and finally a calculating coldness that spoke of damage control protocols engaging. "Colonel Morrison!" she called out, her voice carrying military authority. "You need to cease this conversation immediately. You're revealing information that remains classified." Frank looked at her with the steady gaze of a man who had finally chosen his side. "General, I've been keeping your classified information for 80 years. Bobby Mitchell has been dead for 80 years. The war has been over for 80 years. The only thing that remains classified is the shame of what we did in the name of victory." Eleanor stepped beside Frank, her nurse's training recognizing a man who had finally found the strength to heal an old wound. Frank's right. Some secrets are kept not to protect national security, but to protect national embarrassment. Marcus Webb looked from his recording to the growing crowd of airport travelers who had begun to notice the commotion. "Colonel Morrison, are you willing to go on record with these allegations?" Frank Morrison looked at his great-nephew, at Sarah Mitchell, whose great-grandfather had died in his arms, at Eleanor, who had treated the wounded and kept silent about their stories, and at the journalist who could ensure that this time the truth would not be buried. "Son," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had finally shed an unbearable burden, "I've been on the record for 80 years. I've just been waiting for someone to listen." The weight of truth was about to shift from one old man's shoulders to the broader conscience of a nation that had forgotten the cost of its victories. The weight of truth was about to shift from one old man's shoulders to the broader conscience of a nation that had forgotten the cost of its victories. General Hawthorne moved with the swift precision of someone executing damage control protocols that had been rehearsed but never implemented. Her phone buzzed with encrypted messages from Washington as she approached the growing circle around Frank Morrison, her expression shifting from bureaucratic authority to something more dangerous. "Colonel Morrison, under the National Security Act, I'm ordering you to cease disclosure of classified information immediately." Her voice carried the weight of federal authority, but Frank met her gaze with the steady calm of a man who had finally chosen his battlefield. "General, the National Security Act doesn't apply to war crimes." And that's what this was, sending young men to die to cover up intelligence operations that violated every principle they thought they were fighting for. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her TSA badge catching the fluorescent lights. "General, with respect, this man is a decorated veteran sharing his own combat experience. Since when is that a national security threat?" "Since that experience involves ongoing classified programs," Hawthorne replied, her tone sharpening. "Agent Mitchell, I'm ordering you to return to your duties immediately. This situation is beyond your clearance level." "My clearance level?" Sarah's voice carried a new edge, the anger of someone who had finally understood how deeply they'd been manipulated. "My great-grandfather died in that bomber with Colonel Morrison. Don't talk to me about clearance levels when it comes to my own family's sacrifice." Jimmy Morrison found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his military career: stand with family or follow orders, honor the truth or protect his position. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. "General Hawthorne," Jimmy said, his voice carrying the formal tone of an officer addressing a superior, "I request clarification of the charges against my great-uncle. If he's under arrest, I want to see the warrant. If he's not under arrest, then this detention is illegal." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Captain Morrison, I strongly advise you to consider the implications of your current course of action. Your career, your security clearance, your future in the Air Force, all of it depends on your loyalty to institutional authority." "Ma'am, my loyalty is to the Constitution and the principles my great-uncle fought to defend. If those principles conflict with institutional convenience, I know which side I'm choosing." Marcus Webb was live-streaming now, his phone's camera capturing the confrontation as airport travelers began to gather, drawn by the drama unfolding in their midst. Comments were already flooding his social media feeds as viewers recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. "This is Marcus Webb reporting from Denver International Airport, where a 90-year-old World War II veteran is being detained by federal agents for sharing his combat experiences," he narrated to his phone's camera. "Colonel Frank Morrison, a decorated bomber pilot, is being silenced for revealing what appears to be classified information about military operations from 1944. Agent Park watched the live stream with growing alarm. The story was already spreading, beyond their ability to contain it. His secure phone buzzed with urgent messages from his superiors, each one escalating the pressure to resolve the situation quickly and quietly. But Park found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of honor and sacrifice, of American soldiers who had welcomed Korean fighters as brothers in arms. The man being detained wasn't a foreign agent or a terrorist. He was a veteran, trying to honor fallen comrades by finally telling their story. Elena Vasquez moved to stand beside Frank, her nurse's instincts recognizing a patient who needed support. "General, I treated the survivors of Operation Nightfall. I've kept their secrets for 80 years, just like Frank. But secrets that protect war crimes aren't secrets worth keeping. Mrs. Vasquez, you're also bound by military confidentiality agreements. I'm 88 years old, General. What are you going to do, court-martial me?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp and bitter. "I've watched good men die to protect bad decisions. I've seen young soldiers sacrificed for political convenience, and I've kept quiet about it because I was told it served the greater good. Well, I'm too old to keep serving the greater good when it comes at the cost of basic human decency." Derek Martinez had been watching the confrontation with growing unease. As TSA supervisor, he was caught between federal pressure and his own conscience. The sight of elderly veterans being treated as security threats while federal agents suppressed their stories felt fundamentally wrong. "General," Derek said carefully, "I need to understand the legal basis for detaining these individuals. My staff is asking questions, and I don't have answers that make sense." Hawthorne turned on him with barely controlled fury. "Supervisor?" "Martinez, your staff follows orders. They don't need to understand them." "Actually, ma'am, they do. This is still America, and we don't detain people without cause, regardless of federal pressure." Frank looked around at the circle of allies that had formed. Family, strangers, institutional employees who had chosen conscience over convenience. For the first time in 80 years, he wasn't alone with his burden. "Bobby," he whispered, touching the photograph in his portfolio, "I'm sorry it took so long." Then louder, addressing the growing crowd, "My name is Colonel Franklin Morrison. I served as a bomber pilot in the 398th Bombardment Group during World War II. On October 15, 1944, I participated in Operation Nightfall, a mission that resulted in the deaths of 97 American airmen. We were told we were bombing a German weapons facility. We weren't told that the real mission was to provide cover for the capture of a Nazi scientist whose research would be used by our own government to experiment on American soldiers for decades." After the war ended, Hawthorne stepped forward. "Colonel Morrison, you are under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act." "On what grounds?" Jimmy demanded. "Disclosure of classified information that threatens national security." Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording. "Let the record show that a 90-year-old veteran is being arrested for sharing his own combat experiences." Marcus Webb's live stream was now being watched by thousands, the viewer count climbing. Rapidly, as the story spread across social media, comments poured in from veterans, military families, and citizens outraged by what they were witnessing. Agent Park received another urgent message on his secure phone. This one was different, a direct order from his superiors to ensure that Frank Morrison's testimony was suppressed at all costs. The phrase, "by any means necessary," appeared in the encrypted text, and Park felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked at Frank Morrison, a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country for over 30 years, a grandfather figure surrounded by people who believed in his honesty and integrity. Then he looked at his phone, at orders that seemed to value institutional protection over human dignity. The choice, when it came, was easier than he had expected. Park pulled out his own recording device and stepped toward Frank Morrison. "Sir, I'm Agent David Park, Department of Defense Intelligence. I'm recording this conversation because I believe the American people have a right to know what their government has done in their name." General Hawthorne's face went white. "Agent Park, you are relieved of duty immediately." "Yes, ma'am, I expect I am. But I'm still an American citizen, and I still have a conscience." The lines had been drawn, and the battle for truth was about to begin in earnest. The lines had been drawn, and the battle for truth was about to begin in earnest. Frank Morrison looked at the faces surrounding him, his great-nephew standing at attention in defiance of military authority. The young TSA agent whose great-grandfather had died in his arms, the elderly nurse who had kept secrets for 8 decades, the journalist, broadcasting truth to thousands, and now a federal agent who had chosen conscience over career. For the first time since 1944, Frank felt he had a crew worth flying with. "Agent Park," Frank said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a combat commander, "are you prepared to hear the complete truth about Operation Nightfall?" "Yes, sir. I believe the American people deserve to know what was done in their name." General Hawthorne's phone buzzed with an urgent call. The caller ID showed only POTUS staff. The conversation was brief and intense, her face cycling through expressions of surprise, anger, and finally, grim determination. "Colonel Morrison," she said after ending the call, "you have 5 minutes to reconsider your course of action. After that, this becomes a matter of national emergency protocols." Frank understood the threat. Emergency protocols meant detention, without trial, suppression of witnesses, and the kind of federal overreach that turned citizens into enemies of the state. But he also understood something Hawthorne didn't, that some truths created their own momentum, and this story was already beyond their ability to contain. Marcus Webb's live stream now had over 50,000 viewers, with major news networks picking up the feed. Comments flooded in from military families, veterans organizations, and elected officials demanding answers. The hashtag Operation Nightfall was trending across multiple platforms. "Colonel Morrison," Marcus addressed his phone's camera, "you mentioned that Nazi research was used to experiment on American soldiers. Can you provide specifics?" Frank opened his portfolio completely, revealing documents that few people had seen in 8 decades. Dr. Heinrich Richter's research formed the basis for chemical weapons testing at Edgewood Arsenal, biological warfare experiments at Fort Detrick, and psychological warfare programs that continued into the 1970s. American soldiers were subjected to LSD experiments, chemical exposure tests, and radiation studies, all based on research we captured from the Nazis. Eleanor stepped closer, her nurse's training making her uniquely qualified to understand the medical implications. "I treated veterans from those programs, Frank. Men who came back from Korea and Vietnam with symptoms that didn't match their service records. Unexplained illnesses, psychological trauma that went beyond normal combat stress. The research Bobby Mitchell died to capture was used to poison our own soldiers," Frank said, his voice breaking slightly. "He thought he was protecting American lives. Instead, he was enabling decades of human experimentation on American servicemen." Sarah felt her phone buzzing with messages from TSA headquarters, supervisors demanding explanations, orders to cease. Her involvement immediately. She looked at the messages, then at Frank Morrison, and made a choice that would define the rest of her life. "For the record," she said to Marcus's camera, "I'm Agent Sarah Mitchell, Transportation Security Administration. My great-grandfather, Bombardier Robert Mitchell, died on Operation Nightfall in 1944. For 80 years, my family believed he died fighting Nazis. Today, I learned he died protecting secrets that were used to harm American soldiers. I want answers, and I want justice." Jimmy Morrison's phone was also buzzing, messages from his chain of command, orders to report immediately, threats about his security clearance and career prospects. Like Sarah, he looked at his phone, then at his great-uncle, and chose family over fear. "I'm Captain James Morrison, United States Air Force," he said to the camera. "My great-uncle is Colonel Franklin Morrison, a decorated World War II veteran, who has served his country with honor for over 90 years. He's not a security threat. He's a witness to war crimes that our government has spent decades covering up." Agent Park was recording everything on his official device, creating an evidentiary record that would be impossible to suppress. Colonel Morrison, you mentioned that Dr. Richter was already in Allied custody before Operation Nightfall. Do you have documentation supporting that claim? Frank pulled out a document with classification stamps that made Hawthorne step forward. In alarm. This is a debriefing report dated October 10th, 1944, 5 days before our mission. It details Dr. Richter's capture and the intelligence already extracted from his research. Sir, that document is evidence of premeditated murder, Agent Park. The military knew we were flying into a trap. They knew most of us wouldn't come back. And they sent us anyway because our deaths were necessary to maintain the fiction that Richter's capture was still secret. Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough tragedy to recognize it in all its forms. How many young men died in that operation, Frank? 97 aircrew across 10 bombers, average age 23. Most of them never saw their 24th birthday. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. 97 young Americans sacrificed to protect an intelligence operation that enabled decades of human experimentation on their fellow soldiers. General Hawthorne made a final attempt to reassert control. Colonel Morrison, I'm formally ordering you to cease disclosure of classified information. Agent Park, surrender your recording device immediately. Frank looked at her with the steady gaze of a man who had finally chosen his final mission. General, I've been following orders for 90 years. Bobby Mitchell followed orders right, up until the moment he died in my arms. But some orders are illegal, and some secrets are immoral, and some institutions lose the right to demand loyalty when they betray the very people they're supposed to protect. Park stepped closer to Frank, his recording device held prominently. Sir, for the official record, are you stating that the United States military deliberately sacrificed American aircrew to protect an intelligence operation involving Nazi research? I'm stating that Operation Nightfall was a deliberate sacrifice of American lives to maintain operational security around the capture and utilization of Nazi weapons research. I'm stating that my crew and 9 others were sent to die to protect secrets that enabled decades of human experimentation on American soldiers. And I'm stating that I should have revealed this truth 80 years ago. But I was too young and too trusting to understand that some loyalty is misplaced. Marcus Webb's viewer count had passed 100,000, with news networks now sending crews to the airport. The story was no longer containable through official channels. It had become a public reckoning with historical truth. Colonel Morrison, Marcus asked, what do you want the American people to know about your service and your silence? Frank looked directly into the camera, speaking to a nation that had honored him as a hero without knowing the full cost of his heroism. I want them to know that Bobby Mitchell and 96 other young Americans died believing they were protecting their country. They died because older men decided their lives were worth less than operational convenience. And I want them to know that I've spent 80 years carrying the guilt of surviving while better men than myself paid the price for decisions they never understood. He paused, touching the photograph of his crew one final time. But most of all, I want them to know that some secrets are too heavy for one old man to carry alone. The truth belongs to the families of the men who died, and to the soldiers who were experimented on afterward, and to every American who deserves to know what their government has done in their name. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of approaching sirens. Additional federal agents, local police, and news crews, all converging on Denver International Airport for a confrontation that would reshape how America understood its own history. Frank Morrison had finally completed his mission to honor his fallen crew. The question now was whether the truth would survive the forces that had spent 8 decades trying to bury it. Frank Morrison had finally completed his mission to honor his fallen crew. The question now was whether the truth would survive the forces that had spent 8 decades trying to bury it. 3 months later, Frank stood before the granite memorial that had been erected in Arlington National Cemetery's Section 60, where America's newest heroes were laid to rest. The inscription was simple but profound. In memory of the 97 aircrew of Operation Nightfall, October 15, 1944, they died believing they served with honor. Their sacrifice deserves nothing less than truth. The memorial had been funded by private donations that poured in after Marcus Webb's airport livestream went viral, reaching over 10 million viewers in its first week. Congressional hearings had followed, led by a bipartisan coalition of senators who understood that some truths transcended political convenience. The Veterans Administration had established a special compensation fund for families of soldiers who had been subjected to experiments based on Nazi research. And the Pentagon had begun the long process of declassifying documents related to post-war human experimentation programs. Sarah Mitchell stood beside Frank at the memorial, wearing the uniform of her new position as Director of Veterans Advocacy for the National Security Whistleblower Coalition. She had resigned from the TSA 3 days after the airport incident, but not before receiving a written commendation from the agency's new director, who had recognized that Sarah's actions represented the best traditions of federal service. "Bobby would have been proud of you," Frank said quietly, touching the bronze plaque that bore her great-grandfather's name among the 97 crew members finally acknowledged as heroes rather than footnotes. "I think he would have been proud of you too," Sarah replied. "It took courage to carry that burden for 80 years. It took even more courage to finally let it go." Jimmy Morrison approached in his Air Force uniform, now bearing the rank of major. His promotion had come despite, or perhaps because of, his willingness to stand with family over institutional pressure. The military's public response to Operation Nightfall had included reforms designed to prevent future cover-ups, and officers like Jimmy, who demonstrated moral courage, found themselves leading the cultural change. "Uncle Frank, the Secretary of Defense, is here," Jimmy said. "She'd like a word with you." Frank nodded, unsurprised. Secretary Patricia Williams had been appointed specifically to oversee the military's reckoning with its historical failures. Unlike General Hawthorne, who had been quietly reassigned to a desk job pending investigation, Secretary Williams understood that institutional credibility required acknowledging institutional mistakes. "Colonel Morrison," Secretary Williams said, approaching with the respectful bearing due to a decorated veteran, "I wanted to personally apologize for how you were treated, and to thank you for your service, both during the war and in finally bringing this truth to light. Madam Secretary, the apology should go to the families of the men who died and to the soldiers who were subjected to experiments afterward. I just carried their story. You did more than that, sir. You chose truth over convenience, even when it cost you personally. That's the kind of moral courage the military should exemplify." Marcus Webb joined the group, his press credentials now bearing the logo of the major news network that had hired him after his Operation Nightfall reporting earned him a Pulitzer Prize. His investigative series had exposed not just the historical cover-up, but the ongoing institutional mechanisms that enabled such secrecy. "Colonel Morrison, I wanted you to know that Congress has passed the Military Transparency Act. It requires declassification review of any operation more than 50 years old, with presumption toward public disclosure, unless current national security is directly threatened." Frank smiled, understanding that this represented a fundamental shift in how America approached military secrecy. Bobby and the others didn't die in vain if their story prevents future cover-ups. Eleanor Vasquez approached slowly, using a walker but maintaining the determined bearing that had characterized her confrontation with federal authority. At 88, she had become an unlikely celebrity, her testimony before Congress providing crucial corroboration for Frank's account. "Frank, there's someone I want you to meet," Eleanor said, gesturing toward a younger woman in military dress uniform. "This is Colonel Patricia Chen, the new head of the Army's Historical Review Board. She's responsible for investigating other classified operations that might need similar transparency." Colonel Chen stepped forward with obvious respect. "Colonel Morrison, your courage in revealing Operation Nightfall has opened doors to other historical investigations. We've identified at least 12 other operations that involved questionable decision-making and inadequate transparency. Your example has given other veterans the courage to come forward." Agent David Park appeared at the edge of the gathering, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had found peace with difficult choices. His testimony had been crucial in the congressional hearings, and his decision to record Frank's revelations had provided unimpeachable evidence of government attempts at suppression. "Sir," Park said to Frank, "I wanted to thank you for showing me what real patriotism looks like. I've joined the Government Accountability Project, helping other federal employees who witness wrongdoing to report it safely." Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him. Family members who had chosen truth over convenience, institutional employees who had chosen conscience over career, a journalist who had chosen principle over access, and federal agents who had chosen country over agency. They represented something he had never expected to see again, the same spirit of moral courage that had characterized his generation during World War II. Derek Martinez approached quietly, still wearing his TSA supervisor uniform, but carrying himself with new dignity. "Colonel Morrison, I wanted you to know that TSA has implemented new protocols for veteran screening. Your experience led to policy changes that will prevent future humiliation of military personnel." Frank nodded, his appreciation, then turned back to the memorial wall bearing 97 names. "They deserved better than they got," he said simply. "They deserved to have their sacrifice acknowledged honestly, their deaths mourned publicly, and their service honored completely." As the sun set over Arlington National Cemetery, Frank Morrison stood surrounded by the living legacy of his crew's sacrifice. Operation Nightfall had finally been revealed, not as a shameful secret, but as a cautionary tale about the cost of placing institutional convenience above human dignity. 6 months later, Frank Morrison died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family and friends who had been transformed by his courage. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans, government officials, and ordinary citizens who understood that his final act of service, revealing the truth about Operation Nightfall, represented the best traditions of American democracy. The leather portfolio that had started it all was donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became part of a permanent exhibit about government transparency and the moral courage required to challenge institutional authority. Bobby Mitchell's sacrifice had finally been honored. Frank Morrison's burden had finally been lifted, and America had finally confronted a piece of its own history that was too important to remain hidden. Some secrets Frank had learned were meant to be revealed, and some truths once spoken changed everything for the better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.